Welcome to another video, Purple Political Talk here. Today is Saturday, July 31st, 2021, and today we're going to be discussing the 2024 presidential elections and taking a look at our matchup, which I don't believe is that likely based on where the primaries are going to turn out, most likely, but I think it's actually a very interesting matchup because I would say that both of these candidates are certainly unpopular with certain groups of people, and it's going to be interesting to see how a presidential race between these two candidates would play out. This being a scenario between Texas Senator Ted Cruz and incumbent Vice President Kamala Harris. So I do think it's going to be a very interesting scenario. But before we do start, I want to remind you guys to like, subscribe, and turn on post notifications to be up to date with our latest content. And I also want to remind you guys that channel memberships are now open. If you want to support the channel, getting a channel membership would be a great way to do that and help us grow the channel moving forward. And in that spirit, I do want to give a very big thanks to our Purple Political Talk channel members in David Maxwell. Thank you so much. And also Adam Hurst. We couldn't really do this without you. So yeah, now that we've gotten all of this out of the way, let's get started with the video. So this matchup is going to have some characteristics, I would say, of a 2016 race, in that I would say both candidates are unpopular. You know, Kamala Harris has her media blunders that, you know, she's had many opportunities to come in the good graces of many Americans, but she's blown all those chances pretty much, where she kind of like the laugh and, you know, the border crisis is another thing where she, you know, completely like stopped and like only went after Donald Trump. All of these media things, they're really going to impact a lot of voters when it comes to independents in a lot of swing states and other types of voters. Well, Ted Cruz, I think that a lot of his things come from mainly two places. One, he also has had some very big media blunders, most notably the Cancun cruise, you know, media blunder where he kind of escaped his home state of Texas when it was freezing when they needed him the most. And then he also had, you know, January 6th, which really was going to be a hindering factor for Cruz moving forward. He stood with Hawley, and Josh Hawley, two people that had, I would say, pretty kind of solid laid out futures in the Republican Party, kind of hindered because of January 6th, because, you know, at the end of the day, I think the party moving forward, a lot of the people that are 100%, you know, connected to January 6th, they might not do so well in elections. And I think, out of all the Republicans that were interconnected, and, you know, it's hard to say and pinpoint because a lot of the Republicans were part of that, you know, in the overturning of the election, but, Ted Cruz was a marquee person in that movement, and he's going to get all the blame for anything bad that happened. So I think that those are the two biggest things that are going to be impacting this race, where you have pretty much both candidates having big media blunders and things like that. So this race is really going to be of who do people in certain regions of the country, who do they like a little bit better? Who has better appeal to them? Because I do think that this race is going to be a lot closer than people think. You know, a lot of people put Kamala Harris 100% down, and I would say she's a pretty bad candidate for the Democrats to run, regardless, just because of her, you know, political way of being. However, against someone like Ted Cruz, I think that she could do a little bit better, and we'll see where this scenario takes us. So now that we've gotten all the safe states out of the way, you can see them. We have Ted Cruz at 125 electoral votes, and now we see Kamala Harris at 183. Let's get started with the toss-up states, starting with the likely margins for the Democrats. Or these are states that would go between 15 to 5% for the Democratic Party. So for Kamala Harris, I do think that she takes places like New Mexico, Colorado. I would go as far as saying Virginia as well. I would probably say a state like Minnesota too. I think Kamala Harris could end up winning these states by a margin of around 6, 7, 8, 9, 10%. So these states all have different things that I think go for Kamala Harris, and that's why I think it's interesting to talk about them. So I think in New Mexico, it's more of, you know, it's become more Democratic, and even someone like Ted Cruz from neighboring Texas, who Ted Cruz has somewhat of of Southwestern appeal, though we have to remember a lot of Ted Cruz's appeal is with voters in rural areas. Ted Cruz doesn't really have that well of a suburban appeal. So in these states, for example, I know in Virginia, in New Mexico, Colorado, and even Minnesota, that's something that's going to hinder. And Kamala Harris is going to probably end up winning the suburbs by a little bit more than Ted Cruz. Another thing is that for example, at least in the Southwest, and we could probably like pack in Colorado in there too, in New Mexico as well, that, Ted Cruz, although I think that his support where he does best is kind of already covered. A lot of those rural voters are going to be voting Republican anyway. So I do think that these margins are going to uphold to kind of what they were in 2020. Minnesota is a very interesting, scenario just because of how liberal the state has become. The Minneapolis-St. Paul area has, shifted way more to the left. And yes, there's parts of the state that are shifting a little bit more to the right, especially, that West congressional district right here. That's been shifting a little bit more to the left, or to the right rather. But I do think that even considering that just the growth of the Democratic support in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area is really going to be helping out Kamala Harris winning the state by at least 5%. And I think when you look at this and think about it, it's really not that far-fetched. And Virginia, again, suburban votes are probably going to end up going to Kamala Harris. And Ted Cruz has probably some appeal down in Virginia Beach. However, I do think that the suburbs up north are going to do their job for Kamala Harris and end up going by at least 7%, 6% in a worst case scenario for Harris, I would say. I don't think Ted Cruz has the appeal to end up winning in those states. So now that we've discussed the Democratic likely states, let's move on to the Republican Party. So I think that for the Republicans, with someone like Kamala Harris on the ticket, we could end up seeing places like Iowa and Ohio. I think Ted Cruz actually has exceptional appeal in these states where, evangelical voters is a strong suit of Cruz's. You see, when we look back at the 2016 Republican primaries, what did we see? We saw Ted Cruz do exceptionally well in Iowa. He did moderately okay in Ohio. But yet again, this was a different race because of John Kasich. But that's going too deep into the 2016 primaries. In 2016, what we saw Ted Cruz was do very well with evangelical voters. Again, his appeal as a Texan, Republican really does very well in this kind of area of the country, I would say. Like, kind of this middle belt of the country and then parts of the Midwest. I think that's something that might help him win these races by 10, 11, 12%, especially against someone like Kamala Harris, who is unlikable to a lot of these voters. And I think one of the big things we're going to see with this matchup, if we do end up seeing it, is how polar politics are going to have a very big impact. The country has just become so immensely polarized that it's going to come to a point where the Republican seats are going to become very Republican and the Democrat states are going to become more Democratic. And truly, there will be very few swing states left. So I think that's a part of the country Ted Cruz will do very well in. Going down to the Sun Belt, I do think he could win his own state of Texas and the state of Florida by likely margins. So Kamala Harris is really unpopular in Florida. Joe Biden is a little bit smidge more popular than Kamala Harris in Florida, but it's not by that much. And I think that regardless, we have to consider as well that, there's certain parts of the state that are narrowly trending a little bit more blue, like in Pinellas County, like in Hillsborough County, like in Duval County. But there's something I want to point out there that was with Joe Biden on the ticket. Kamala Harris won her campaign, her negative campaign ads, like the attack ads, are going to be a lot more tough. And I think that in a state like Florida, where socialism is feared like the devil, I think that we're going to end up seeing a very, very big, pushback against a Kamala Harris candidacy. And I think that Ted Cruz could win the state by a margin of around 5 to 6%. I don't think it would be a blowout. And same in his own state of Texas. He is from Texas, and, he appeals to his Republican voters. He has his supporters. Now, I do think that would also be kind of a hindering factor. But I think that even though that would be a hindering factor where you see, some of his voters being a little bit bitter against him because, a lot of different things that have happened during his term as senator, I do think that they will still end up voting for him similar to 2020 margins, probably 5 to 6, at most 7% against someone like Kamala Harris. So that covers all our likely states. Now our totals stand up at Ted Cruz at 218 and Kamala Harris at 221. As we can see, with how the scenario currently is, it's a very close race. Let's now move on to the lean states. These are states that would go by less than 5%, but more than 1.5%. Let's start off with the Democrats. So I think that Kamala Harris has certain parts of the country where she could do a little bit better. I think that places like Nevada, I think, is a place that she could probably end up winning by 3 to 4%, 5% at most. I think this is a state that's going to be very interesting to watch moving forward politically because, this is a state has been shifting. The Democrats have moved way to the far of the left. And, I think that that's something that has happened more at an intense level in the state of Nevada than in other states. But another thing that we're seeing is that the Republican Party is certainly moving a little bit more to the right. So, and that's something that has been happening more nationally, to the point where, it's more mainstream than the far left movement that has taken over some parts of the Democratic Party. Now, the further right movements in the GOP are more mainstream. So it's going to be a thing of how well can the Democrats, keep their support, and can the GOP, win over some of those moderate voters or their current messaging. And I think in a state like Nevada, it's probably going to stay pretty standard for it was in 2023, 4-5%. That's where we're looking at ballpark. And I do think that Nevada is a state that would vote for Kamala Harris. Other states that I think would go for Kamala Harris by a lean margin is the state of New Hampshire. I think this is a state that really likes, it's really likes establishment Democrats for some reason, just because of how, there's a lot of college educated voters in the state. And I do think that Kamala Harris kind of appeals to that group of voters a little bit better, just because of how she, has that identity politics side of her. She has those things that, really appeal to these voters. And I do think that she is the right candidate for the Democrats to run if they want to win in New Hampshire. Again, it's 4 electoral votes and it's not much. And I don't think that Ted Cruz would do very well in this state compared to some other Republicans like Ron DeSantis. But I do think that Kamala Harris would probably take that state by a lean margin. Let's move on to the lean states for Ted Cruz. I think that these are states that, Ted Cruz has a possibility of winning by a little bit more. So, starting off with the state of North Carolina, I do think that Ted Cruz could end up winning here by around 1.5-2%. I don't think it's going to be by much, but I do think that he has that, rural voter appeal. And, as another thing I wanted to mention, at a nationwide level, while we are seeing the suburban, areas, they're turning a little bit more Democratic. One of the things that we have to analyze is that the Republican Party is doing a better job in urban areas. They're increasing their support in big urban areas, and I think something that would benefit them in areas like North Carolina. I do think that against someone like Kamala Harris, it would definitely be a close race, but I don't think that her messaging would go very well in the state of North Carolina. She could probably do very well with African American voters, but I think that, rural voters, which make up a very big part of the electorate in the state of North Carolina, will turn away from voting for someone like Kamala Harris. And, I do think that Ted Cruz wins in Maine's 2nd district. I think this is a place that he could win by a lean margin. I do think, and this is considering if it stays the way it is now with the way the district lines are drawn. This is a very conservative district, and they like conservative Democrats, but not someone like Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is a little bit too far to the left for this district, and I think Ted Cruz definitely beats her out in that state. So that covers our lean states for Ted Cruz. Let's move on to the tilt states. These are going to be the toss-up states that are going to be extremely close in this race, and they're going to be deciding factors. So let's start off with Arizona, and let's move eastward. So in the state of Arizona, I do think that this is one of the states that I'm really conflicted upon, because one of the things I'm asking myself is, can Ted Cruz go in and gain enough support in Maricopa County to win the race? And I think the answer to that is no. Now, the other question is, can Kamala Harris do well enough in Maricopa County to, hinder away Ted Cruz? And I think the answer is no as well. So this race in Arizona, I do think is a complete toss-up. I do think that based on what Ted Cruz has done in the past, he's kind of associated a little bit more with, the January 6th movement and things like that. And I don't think that really goes well with a lot of, voters in the Democratic and the Democratic and independent parties in Maricopa County. So I do think that Kamala Harris very, very narrowly edges out Ed Cruz in the state. Did I just say Ed Cruz? Okay. Disregard that. Ted Cruz. That's funny. Ted Cruz in the state of Arizona. So I do think that that's something that could end up happening. Moving on eastward, let's talk about Nebraska's 2nd congressional district. Again, I think this is going to be a close race. I do think that Kamala Harris ends up taking it by a pretty much, I would say actually maybe a lean margin as well. I mean, I think this is one of the places that I'm really conflicted about as well, because, this is a somewhat moderate to, conservative leaning district. They like liberals it's a very weird district politically, right? And I do think that Ted Cruz could have that certain appeal, but I do think Kamala Harris just edges it out, because I think she's the type of candidate to win in this race, and I think she takes that district. So now let's move on to the state of Wisconsin right here. I think this is a state that Ted Cruz could actually end up winning. He won here in the 2016 Republican primary, and I think that he actually has a very good chance of winning here. I do think that a lot of voters in certain regions of the state are really going to like Ted Cruz, evangelical voters, working class voters, and I think Ted Cruz has a relatively better working class, appeal than Kamala Harris, and I do think that he could actually edge her out in some of these Midwestern states. And I think that he has better appeal in this region of the country where Kamala Harris's appeal is not that good. Moving on down to the state of Georgia, let's talk about Georgia for a second. I do think in Georgia, Kamala Harris narrowly edges it out. I think Georgia, the way that the suburbs have gone, where you have country club Republicans that I do not think we're going to like Ted Cruz. You have that immense amount of African American voters in, a lot of the Atlanta suburban counties. That's probably going to just, paint a Kamala Harris victory in the state, even if it is by 1 or 1.5%. I think that she's able to increase her Joe Biden's 2020 numbers in the state of Georgia. So I feel it's something that would be interesting. Let's move up to the last two Midwestern states. Let's talk about Pennsylvania. I do think that Pennsylvania has the possibility of going to Ted Cruz by a very close margin. I think that ultimately what's gonna turn away some suburban voters in some parts of the state, but I do think that his working class appeal is massively a lot better in certain ways than Kamala Harris. I think that the conflicting argument with Ted Cruz is really his associations to the January 6th movement and to a lot of his media blunders, and Kamala Harris has also had some pretty bad media blunders, but I think at a certain extent the way that everything's set up, where you have a media where it's very obvious that they lean more to the left and the type of campaigning they do pretty much, and their shows have become pretty much telling you like false information in some cases, and I think that Ted Cruz is gonna be a lot more impacted by that than Kamala Harris. There's always there's people that influence elections, and I think the media is the big influencer in a lot of these elections. Remember, communications is the key to winning the White House, and I do think that in a certain way that's something that really helps out Kamala Harris. And in a state like Pennsylvania, I think that could gain her some support, but I do think that Ted Cruz still edges it out. So now the deciding factor is actually the state of Michigan. 15 electoral votes decides a race because Ted Cruz is at 264 and Kamala Harris is at 259. In the state of Michigan, this is a very close race in my opinion. I'm going to have to give it to Ted Cruz, I think. I think that Ted Cruz very nearly edges Michigan over Kamala Harris. You do have that big amount of, voters in Detroit that really are going to end up coming out for Kamala Harris in big numbers. But I think in areas where Joe Biden did well, like Grand Rapids, and if you move to Ann Arbor, another, somewhat working class town, I think we're going to end up seeing a very big support for Ted Cruz in those areas. And while Kamala Harris could do very well in the suburbs of Detroit, I do think that Michigan is probably going to end up voting for Ted Cruz. So I think there's going to be a very close race. And I think the most interesting thing here is to see how the Midwest goes red and then the Sun Belt goes blue. I do think that Ted Cruz is actually not the best candidate for the Sun Belt. I think he's actually one of the worst candidates the Democrats could run to win in the Sun Belt. However, I do think that he's one of the best candidates to run in the industrial working class Midwest. So I think this is my final prediction. Ted Cruz at 279 to Kamala Harris's 259. Tell me what you guys think down in the comments. I think this is actually a very interesting scenario. Did you guys agree with my prediction? Do you guys disagree? So let me know. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If so, please give it a huge thumbs up, like, subscribe, turn on post notifications to be up to date with our latest content. And again, thank you guys so much for watching, and goodbye.